Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me give a talk at Tufts Undergraduate Research Symposium. The title of my talk today is From Is to Ought, the Normative Implications of Moral Psychology. So there are going to be three parts to my talk today. First, I'm going to introduce three different sorts of views that we might have about the relationship between moral psychology and moral philosophy. Second, I'm going to ask, how does moral psychology teach us about moral philosophy? That is, what sorts of pedagogical tools does the field of moral psychology bring to the table when we're thinking about issues in moral philosophy? And finally, I'm going to ask, what does moral psychology teach us about moral philosophy? That is, how can we use these pedagogical tools, which we learned in the second part of the talk, to assess and analyze the empirical data and apply them to lessons in moral philosophy? So I'm going to start by outlining three views about the relationship between moral psychology and moral philosophy. The first view is what I call the insignificance view. And the insignificance view says that the neuroscience and psychology of moral judgment and decision-making have no normative implications for how we ought to make moral judgments. This view has been articulated by people like Tamsin Shaw, who says that an understanding of the neural correlates of moral reasoning can tell us nothing about whether the outcome of this reasoning is justified. We see the insignificance view articulated by people like Salim Berger, who says either attempts to derive normative implications from these neuroscientific results rely on a shoddy inference, or they appeal to substantive normative intuitions that render the neuroscientific results irrelevant to the overall argument. A very different sort of view we might take is what I call the dominance view. And this view is at the opposite end of the spectrum from the insignificance view. The dominance view says that moral psychology can, at least in principle, teach us everything there is to know about moral philosophy. Now, I don't think any philosopher or psychologist actually adheres to this view. We see people like Paul Bloom saying, quote, "The fact that one cannot derive morality from psychological research is so screamingly obvious that I never thought to explicitly write it down." And we see similar sentiments echoed by people like Steven Pinker and Jonathan Haidt. But there's a view in the middle, which I call the relevance view. And this is the view I'm going to be arguing for throughout this presentation. So according to the relevance view, normative facts cannot be derived entirely from facts about the neuroscience and psychology of moral judgment and decision-making. Nevertheless, moral psychology is highly relevant to normative questions of how we ought to make moral judgments. And I think the person who has done more to champion this view than anyone else in the field is Joshua Green, a psychologist from Harvard, who says, quote, "I agree with traditional ethicists that there is a sharp and crucial distinction between the is of science and the ought of ethics, but maintain nonetheless that science, and neuroscience in particular, can have profound ethical implications by providing us with information that will prompt us to reevaluate our moral values and our conceptions of morality." Now I'm going to take a step back for just a moment and tell you what I'm talking about when I use the term morality. Now, this is a bit of a slippery term because emerging research suggests that the meaning of morality can be indeterminate and variable. What people think of morality can vary between cultures, between people within a given culture. It can even vary within the same individual depending on the context in which she finds herself. So, because I only have about a 20-minute presentation, I'm going to sweep this very big issue under the rug by simply stipulating that when I talk about morality for the next 20 minutes, what I mean is the way we ought to behave towards others in light of our values. Alright, so there are two questions that we can ask about the relevance view. First, we can ask, how does moral psychology teach us about moral philosophy? What sort of pedagogical tools does it give us when we're thinking about moral philosophy? And the second question we can ask is, what does moral psychology teach us about moral philosophy? That is, when we apply these tools to research and data, what sort of picture of moral philosophy emerges from it? This brings us to the second part of our presentation of how moral psychology teaches us about moral philosophy. What I'm going to suggest is that there are two main tools that moral psychology gives us as moral philosophers. The first is what I call the revealed preferences function. The revealed preferences function can reveal hidden pro-social preferences, which we ourselves may not realize we have. The second tool is what I call the debunking function, and the debunking function explains away objects of merely ostensible moral importance. So I'm going to start by giving you examples of how each of these functions work in a field other than moral psychology. So here's a great study that shows how revealed preferences work from 1996. What the researchers did was they showed participants one of two dictionaries. So the first group of participants, they showed them a dictionary, Dictionary A, in which were defined 10,000 words. And this dictionary is just like new. And they said, how much do you think you'd be willing to pay for this dictionary? And it turns out that people are willing to pay about $24 for Dictionary A. Now for a second group of participants, they give them a different dictionary, Dictionary B. Dictionary B has about 20,000 words defined in it. The cover's a little bit torn, but otherwise it's just like new. And they asked the participants, how much would you be willing to pay for this dictionary? And now people say, around $20. Now the interesting part comes when they present participants with both dictionaries at the same time. So to a third group of participants, they did a joint presentation condition, where they showed them both A and B at the same time, and they said, which do you prefer and how much are you willing to pay for them? What they found was that people are actually willing to pay more for Dictionary B than they are for Dictionary A. This is a reversal of the pattern we saw when they were presented in isolation. So what this study illustrates is a classic example, a textbook example, of economically irrational behavior. So according to economic rationality, preferences should abide by a transitivity rule. That is, if I prefer A to B and B to C, I should necessarily prefer A to C. And irrational behavior is a violation of this transitivity rule, which is exactly what we see here. People are willing to pay more than $22 for Dictionary A and less than $22 for Dictionary B, and yet they're willing to pay more for Dictionary B than they are for Dictionary A. What I think comes out of this study is that the revealed preference structure is somewhat different. When participants have all of the information, when they can compare dictionaries B and A side by side, what we see is that they actually value Dictionary B at greater than $22 and Dictionary A at less than $22. So moving on to the debunking function, I think a really good illustration of this comes from this study from Adelson in 1995. So I want you to take a look at this picture on the screen and just look at the different squares A and B. And I want you to tell me which square do you think looks like a lighter shade of gray. And I'm going to ask for hands in just a second. So you can say that A is the lighter shade of gray, or that B is the lighter shade of gray, or that they're both the same shade of gray. So let's see hands. Who thinks that A is the lighter shade of gray? All right, and who thinks B is the lighter shade of gray? Okay, and who thinks they're both the same shade of gray? All right, so a couple of people have seen this optical illusion before. Actually, A and B are the same shade of gray. And we can see this pretty clearly by overlaying solid gray bars over both A and B. Now the question becomes, why does this optical illusion occur? Why does it seem like B is the lighter shade of gray when in fact A and B are the same shade of gray? Well, the basic idea is that the visual system knows that things in the shade tend to appear darker than they would in the light. So it compensates for this automatically by making things that fall in the shade appear lighter than they actually are on the screen. The lesson I want you to take from this is that psychology can allow us to debunk or explain away our misperceptions. Alright, so I'm going to move on to the third part of the talk, which is what specifically does moral psychology teach us about moral philosophy? So I'm going to take the two tools that I just discussed and apply them to specific studies in literature about altruism and pro-social decision-making. Here's a really great study from my former lab partner, Lucius Caviola, in Oxford. So he did this study to show how the revealed preferences function works in what's called overhead aversion. So to one set of participants, he showed them a charity A, and he said for every $1,000 given to charity A, $600 is going to overhead. It's going to pay salaries, it's going to pay the CEO's salary, but with the extra $400, charity A is going to save the lives of 5 people. And he said, supposing I were to give you $500, how much of that do you think you would be willing to donate to charity A? And people say, nah, I'd be willing to donate around $150 to charity A. To a different group of participants, he presented charity B. For every $1,000 donated to charity B, only $50 goes to overhead, so it's a very efficient charity. And with the remaining $950, it saves 2 lives. And he said, supposing I were to give you $500, how much would you be willing to donate to charity B? And now people say they'd be willing to donate around $250, which is substantially more than they were willing to donate to charity A. Here's the interesting thing. For a third group of participants, he presented them with both charities at once and said, supposing I were to give you $500, how much would you donate to charity A, how much would you donate to charity B, and how much would you keep for yourself? And now what we see is that people are willing to donate around $300 to charity A and only about $100 to charity B. Again, this is a textbook example of irrational behavior. People are willing to donate more than $200 to charity B and less than $200 to charity A in the separate presentation conditions, and yet people are willing to donate more to charity A than they are to charity B in the joint presentation condition. What this shows is that when participants have all of the relevant information to properly consider what decision they're going to make, their revealed preferences show that they value charity A at more than $200, which is more than they value charity B. So even though it seems like we care deeply about overhead, what we actually care about is doing as much good as we can with our donation. All right, so this is a really great illustration of how the debunking function works. So this is a study from Joshua Green, who I mentioned earlier, and his undergraduate student, Jay Musin. And it showed what I call the physical proximity bias. Now, according to the physical proximity bias, people are less willing to donate to help others who are physically distant from them. And this is a really robust result. You find the physical proximity bias even when you give participants vignettes that control for things like relationship to the donor, country of origin and residence, cultural similarity, ability to help, and several other factors that you might think are confounds in this scenario. Now, I'm just going to stipulate that we would not explicitly endorse the principle that some people's lives become less valuable as a function of how far away from us they happen to be at this moment. So just imagine someone comes up to you on the street and says, hey, would you like to donate a few dollars to feed starving children? It would be a really weird response if you said something like, well, that depends. How far away from me are these starving children you're going to be feeding? This just doesn't strike us as the appropriate sort of response. Now the question becomes, why does it seem like physical proximity is morally important, when in fact physical proximity is clearly very unimportant? Here are 2 possible evolutionary explanations. First, it could be the case that physical proximity is a cue that people are in our tribe, and physical distance is a cue that people are members of the outgroup. And 100,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, when group selection was a very important force in shaping the human genome, it was really important to be able to identify people who were members of the in-group and members of the out-group, and selectively help members of the in-group. So perhaps this is what's going on. Another possible explanation is that 100,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, we simply had no ability to help people who weren't within a few miles of us. If someone is being attacked by a lion 3 miles away, even if we really want to help them, there's not much we can do. And so maybe our brain just says, you know what, you can't really do anything anyway, you might as well just forget about them. So perhaps the reason physical proximity appears morally important to us is that we have these evolved, outdated heuristics that no longer serve to help us achieve what we value. Now, I've only got a short presentation, so I don't have time to defend the hypothesis that I'm going to put forth in much detail. Maybe we can get to that in the Q&A. But what I'm going to suggest to you is that when we apply these tools to the field of moral psychology more broadly, the picture of moral psychology that seems to be emerging is what I want to call big picture utilitarianism. So according to big picture utilitarianism, when you zoom out from the very narrow picture of me and my friends and my family and my community members, and you consider the vast majority of the world's population, with whom you have no special social relationship, we are going to find that our one and only desire for most of the world's population is to maximize their happiness and minimize their suffering. I think this is going to be an approximation for our revealed moral preferences. So in essence, our revealed preferences are going to show that we care much more about utilitarian goals than we currently think we do. And the debunking function is going to show that we can explain away most of our deontological intuitions as something like a moral illusion. Now, big picture utilitarianism is certainly a descriptive model of morality, but in what sense is this normative? Well, big picture utilitarianism is a normative model in the sense that it approximates our actual moral values. Now, one could easily turn around and say, well, Dylan, what makes our actual moral values the normative standard? To which I would respond by referring to the stipulative definition I offered earlier, that morality is the way we ought to behave towards others in light of our values. This might seem like a bit of a cheap philosophical move, but again, I've got about 20 minutes in the presentation, so if you'd like to talk about this more, let's save that for the Q&A. Here are some questions that I think we should ask about big picture utilitarianism and pro-social decisions, such as where we donate to charity and how much we donate to charity. In one focus group, they asked participants, do you care about donating to the most effective charities? And the overwhelming majority of participants, 90% of participants says, yes, obviously I care about donating to the most effective charities. And the researchers followed up by saying, all right, so because you care so much about donating to the most effective charities, I would presume that you've done some research to find out what the most effective charities are. And now people start squirming uncomfortably in their seats, because in fact, only 3% of the focus group participants could honestly say that they have done any research to ensure that they are donating to the most effective charities. Is this a reflection of our actual moral values? Or is this perhaps indicative of a cognitive bias? Here's another example. The average American donates 2.1% of their income to charity. Now consider that the median household in the United States is wealthier than 97% of households in the world. That is, the average American is wealthier than 97% of the world's population. And yet, the average American donates only 2.1% of their income to charity. Is this really the amount of money we think we should be donating? Or do we think we should be doing more? Is this reflective of our actual moral values? Or is this reflective of a cognitive bias? Consider that 96% of the money we donate goes to help our fellow countrymen, and only 4% of the money that is donated by US donors goes to help people in the developing world. This is in spite of the fact that problems in the developing world are generally orders of magnitude more severe than problems we face in the United States. Consider the fact that the poorest quintile of the world's population is 10 times as destitute as the poorest quintile of the US population. Consider that the child mortality rate of sub-Saharan Africa is 20 times that of the US. And yet, we're only donating 4% of our charitable donations to help them. Is this a reflection of our actual moral values, or is this indicative of a cognitive bias? These questions trespass on the territory of both philosophy and psychology. And I think the more we learn by studying moral psychology, the more we are going to discover that our moral values can and should reflect a desire to maximize well-being impartially for everyone. Thank you.